So it won't be long before the first volume of The Psychology of the Machine is published. Is that right?
Yeah, end of April. Normally, you'd only take on such a grandiose project when you're young. Corona was a strange standstill. It was almost like a call to gather yourself together and use the time for answering all the questions that have accumulated over the years when you're alone, I mean. And last but not least, it has to do with the strange present in which the ghosts of the past are resurrected. So it isn't coincidental that the first volume is dedicated to the unease of modernity.
Yeah, that was a shared feeling. When we talked about the details of the book. Yeah, maybe we should look at the overall project. Why is it necessary to deal with the psychology of the machine? Isn't that a bit of a contradiction?
Yeah, to a certain degree. If you understand the machine as belonging to the realm of dead things, sure. But if there's one thing I know with certainty, it is that this belief is a pious error, which is why folks, by the way, are always resorting to conjuring the curse and blessing of technology. No, historically, the machine is rather like a magic mirror in which we humans recognize ourselves, or more precisely, miss ourselves, as can be seen today in the chatter of artificial intelligence, as if a computer was intelligent. It's precisely this unconscious that interested me. And that's why the philosophy is followed by a psychology of the machine. To put it another way, one understands oneself as something else, an alien in your Levinasian understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Okay, so in the early drafts, you brought this Nietzsche quote to my attention. It was a way of helping me understand how this turn in your thinking came about. Who was a psychologist before me among all philosophers? And were they not rather high impostors or idealists? There wasn't any psychology before me.
Yeah, the wonderful quote. And Nietzsche precisely captured this blind spot, this philosophical megalomania. There's this other wonderful quotation from him that's dedicated to the love of the furthest from me, Fernstenliebe, and which really affected me deeply. And here the question clearly appears. He says, higher than love to your neighbor is love to the furthest and future ones. Higher still than love to man, it's love to things and phantoms. Higher to the love than man is high the love to things and phantoms. This actually means that unconscious, which forms us but doesn't appear in the collective horizon of thought.
I remember when you first gave me this quote. It made such an impression on me that I often referred back to it. Do I advise you to love your neighbor? Better still, I advise you to flee your neighbor and to love your distant neighbor. Higher than the love for the neighbor is the love for the most distant and future. Higher than the love to your neighbor is the love for the furthest and the future ones. Higher still than to love to men is love to things and phantoms. That love for things and phantoms is what you meant by the psychotope, isn't it? So, how did the idea of the psychotope, this unconsciousness, develop into a book series?
Yeah, I had an invitation from the IWN in Vienna that started me working on a number of questions, all these unanswered questions, in fact. But it became increasingly clear that the whole project was beyond the scope of a monograph, way too big. Or as you often quoted to me from Dune, the answer is beyond the scope of the question. That was my position. Instead, what started me delving into the work of Bronislaw Malinowski and anthropology. But it was kind of obvious that all institutions we take for granted, like the state, etc., can actually be explained from the anthropological perspective. The alien god of monotheism, the idea of law, isonomy, equality, economy, there's no justice in nature. All these concepts aren't prefigured in tribalism, aren't prefigured in nature.
Well, Martin, that lecture was my first awareness of you in 2021, wasn't it? I remember immediately just needing to understand your thinking. And now I'm understanding you were just starting to write this series. Oh, yeah. More importantly, I now understand the first book's title, Above the Sea of Air. It's the idea that the extraterrestrial isn't really a metaphor, but it's something quite tangible. You need to tell us more about this.
When I started thinking about the machine, I linked digitalization to the history of electricity, but I didn't really fully grasp the transition from the mechanical worldview on the one hand, the rotating rework, through its transformation into the steam-powered, liquefied, digitized modernity, if you will. That is, until I looked into the work of Robert Boyle and his discovery of the vacuum. And that's when I found this Torricelli discovery. Evangelista Torricelli, the follower of Galileo Galilei, who climbed a mountain with his barometer in tow and noticed that the higher he got, the further down the mercury dropped. And from this he concluded that the weight of air was decreasing, that at some point the air would become too thin to breathe, eventually it turning into vacuum as you moved across the borderline. And that's what the discovery of the vacuum means, that you intellectually move across over a border into space, free from all dirt and the atmospheric distortions, looking down on the blue planet.
Yeah, de facto, we can't survive in space. That's essentially purified of all earthly dirt. That's really a striking example of the Joseph Wright painting, the one that you can see Boyle has placed this beautiful white dove under a bell jar, and he's hooked it up to this invention of his, the Boylean vacuum pump, and he deprives it of the very air it breathes. And of course, his audience is in this transfixed freak out of the horror and their shock. What struck me so funny when you showed me that painting is that it's exactly how I'd come to understand science, with its kind of inherent callousness in the vehicular vacuum of the clinical research I saw going on around me. It's what Heidegger meant when he said science has its own methodology, isn't it?
Yeah, sure, exactly. That's the cognitive dissonance of modernity, that you mentally find yourself in this extraterrestrial space, in a vacuum that you could only survive in as a cyborg, as a cybernetically augmented organism. But on the other hand, you're also a human being, an earthly citizen who needs air to breathe and temperate climate to thrive. And this schism, so to speak, is the oscillating schizophrenia running through our whole modern age. And it becomes all the more unbearable exactly in the measure of modernization of itself.
That's why the book's subtitle, On the Discomfort of
Yeah.
Modernity. And the strange part is the more modernity moves into the space of the computer, that is, the more it
Yeah.
transitions over
Yeah.
the borderline
Mhm.
into the next universal machine, the stronger the resistance, where it becomes reflected in various attempts to move into a kind of a falsely prophesized new age. That's really just infinite deferral. It goes nowhere.
Yeah, but we need to slow down a little bit before jumping too far ahead, missing details. You see, we're at a juncture, or rather, we've been at one for a while now, where society's old universal machine with its real-world operating system has been winding down as a new one has been powering up to replace it. And now we're on the borderline of the new operating system with its drive to digitalization, which is completely taking over artificial intelligence and all the like. And that's why this ratio of unease is becoming so overwhelmingly unbearable. So much so that people have been proclaiming postmodernism as if they could protect themselves with speech acts that can't stop or control what's neither stoppable or controllable.
Yeah, I find your perspective fascinating because it's so completely different than my own background. I mean, you already know I was having trouble making sense of this when I first met you. On the one hand, there's this unquestionable progress of bringing these old indolent social problems under control and slowly curing them, which is great. But then it's also obvious we've lost control of things a long time ago, despite what we may think, which politicians, of course, they grift from. It also means that we can't return to some paradise fantasy of the natural world, nor the carefree, softened memories of an earlier age, because they really don't exist. Um, and then you see how the sleep of reason has given birth to all these modern monsters, which again can all be grifted from in terms of power. I see precisely the extent that this unease with progress demands its price, and even worse, may play out as forms of authoritarian and totalitarian power grifting. This is what makes your story so compelling. It's the psychology of modernity's unconscious outsourcing of being unable to recognize yourself in your own creation, and that these zombies appear.
Yeah, the zombie that moved me really deeply. Maybe that if you take the modern driving forces into consideration, you have to deal with the uncanny, with the zombies, or more precisely, the unconscious. In this sense, one could speak of the emergence of the unconscious from the spirit of electricity. That's perhaps the greatest insight, namely that one must understand the respective universal machine as the collective unconscious. Nowadays, this can be almost grasped with the hands, because one does not like to make friends with the future. One takes refuge in morality, in the past, and in apocalypse. I must confess, I found the video you sent me from San Francisco absolutely adorable. Elderly gents and ladies draped in penitential robes in a quiet circular procession, uh, announcing the impending plagues of climate change, heat waves, famines, floods. It immediately made me paraphrase Nietzsche. He who fights with fossils must be careful not to become a fossil himself. Hmm?
yeah, yeah, the Thousand Grandmother March. Yeah, the cognitive dissonance is sky high in its unease, isn't it? Grandparents wanting to save the environment for the grandkids, but they don't want to stop traveling to see them. Sadly, some of my older peers just want to indulge in saving the world for the upcoming generation. But when it comes down to doing anything and things seem too complex or simply too painful, they don't really do anything but protest. Um, let's get back to your book series. What's the other books got to do? What do they deal with?
The second volume jumps back deep into the beginning of modern anthropology to Bronislaw Malinowski and his Trobrianders, Melanesia, in fact. This is where I bring us aliens into relief as our ancestors, the weird Greeks, how the culture has spread to all corners of the world invariably, and why our invocation of the human, all too human, doesn't lead us any further, thus strengthening the necessity of turning to the psychotrope. Only by this means we can understand such phenomena as money, interest, law, equality, etc. So the Trobrianders had nothing of these. Yeah? The third volume, called From Heaven's Fire, deals with the birth of monotheism more precisely. It shows that monotheism is basically the consequence of mechane. It discusses what you frequently say about religion being a machine. In this respect, it's no coincidence that Jesus claims his kingdom is not of this world and that Valentinus imagines a foreign god, an alien god. Volume 4, titled Sham Production, that's about economy in fact, deals with the logic of delusion. These 4 parts are already written. There will be a 5th part entitled Power Word, which deals with the question of political power, and at the end of which I take up the idea of the alien logic again.
And including the philosophy of the machine, that makes a series of 6 volumes, yeah?
Yeah, it's a long book. and that's one we've pretty much finished translating into English, and that should be published soon.
Yeah. It's that final volume I'm waiting on because I think it'll answer all those questions I keep asking you about, like authenticity and the post-truth age, and then what ethics and spirituality looks like in a post-atheistic world.
Oh, yeah, these grand questions that frighten me.
And then that's what's going to be most interesting. Um, yeah, yeah. What refocusing here? What's been the most satisfying aspect of this work?
Perhaps that all of this was kind of associated with a series of discoveries. I can't remember any phase of my life that's been connected with such intense reading, including reading my earlier writing with you, which I really hadn't done before because of shame. But it was not really boundless, and so there was never the feeling that I could lose myself. Quite the opposite. All of a sudden, there were all kind of new connections, a really fascination of the things I never saw before. And basically, that's the best thing that can happen to an author, that your metaphors, hunches, and associations are confirmed by the material, by reality itself, that you haven't made anything up, but that your intuition has brought to light a collective unconscious.